My family called me crazy when I spent my last $30,000 on a house they said belonged in a junkyard. They laughed even harder when I quit my job to fix it up. But none of them were laughing when the city announced a $3 million redevelopment plan. That made my junk house worth more than all their homes combined. The house at 847 Maple Street wasn't much to look at when I first saw it. Paint peeling like old scabs, windows boarded up with plywood that had seen better decades, and a front porch that sagged so badly it looked like it was giving up on life. The realtor, Janet, kept apologizing as we walked through the overgrown yard, stepping over broken bottles and rusted car parts that previous owners had left behind like archaeological layers of neglect. "I'm sorry, Sarah," she said for the third time, pushing aside a branch that had grown through what used to be a fence. "I know this isn't what you had in mind when you said you wanted to buy your first house, but given your budget and the current market..." I wasn't listening to her apologies. I was seeing something else entirely. While Janet saw a disaster, I saw potential. The bones of the house were solid. I could tell from my years in the Army Corps of Engineers. The foundation was concrete, not the cheap block construction that would crumble in a few years. The roofline was straight, meaning the frame was still good. The lot was huge, almost 3 times the size of the cookie-cutter suburban homes my siblings lived in. "How long has it been empty?" I asked, running my hand along the exterior wall. The siding was aluminum, old but durable. Underneath the grime and neglect, this place had good bones. "About 8 years," Janet replied, consulting her notes. "The last owner was an elderly man who passed away. His children live out of state and just want to get rid of it. That's why the price is so..." She trailed off, not wanting to say low in case it sounded like she was trying to pressure me. $30,000. It was every penny I had saved during my 4 years stationed overseas. While other soldiers spent their deployment money on cars and electronics, I had lived like a monk, sending almost my entire paycheck back to a savings account. I had a plan, even then. I wanted to own something, to build something with my own hands. After years of temporary barracks and rented apartments, I craved permanence. The inside of the house was worse than the outside. Water damage had warped the hardwood floors in the living room, and someone had started to renovate the kitchen but abandoned the project halfway through. Cabinets hung open like broken jaws, exposing rotted drywall behind them. The bathroom upstairs had a hole in the floor where the toilet used to be, and I could see clear through to the kitchen below. But I also saw the 12-foot ceilings with their original crown molding still intact. I saw the built-in bookcases flanking the fireplace, solid oak underneath layers of paint. I saw the way the afternoon light streamed through the unboarded windows, illuminating dust motes that danced like possibilities in the air. "The electrical needs to be completely redone," Janet continued, flipping light switches that did nothing. "And the plumbing, well, let's just say you'd basically be starting from scratch. Most people would just tear it down and build new." That's when I knew this was my house. Most people would tear it down. Most people would see it as too much work, too much risk. But I wasn't most people. I was Staff Sergeant Sarah Martinez, and I had rebuilt water treatment facilities in the desert, constructed temporary bridges over rivers that didn't exist on any map, and turned military surplus into functional living spaces for entire platoons. I walked through every room twice, taking mental notes. The dining room had beautiful bay windows that just needed new glass. The master bedroom upstairs was spacious enough for a king-size bed and a sitting area. The basement was dry, which meant the foundation was solid. The backyard, once cleared of debris, would be perfect for a garden. "I'll take it," I told Janet, who stopped mid-sentence in her litany of warnings about structural issues. "You... what? Sarah? Are you sure? Maybe you should think about it overnight, or have someone else take a look." "I'm sure." I pulled out my phone and called my bank. Within an hour, I had confirmed my pre-approval for the loan. By the end of the week, I was signing papers. The house came with 2 acres of land in a neighborhood that had seen better days but wasn't completely forgotten. Most of the other houses were occupied, if not well maintained. There was a corner store 3 blocks away that had been there since the 1950s, run by an Italian family who knew everyone's name. The elementary school at the end of the street was old but solid, with a playground that kids still used every afternoon. What Janet and the seller and probably everyone else didn't know was that I had done my homework. I had spent weeks researching property records, zoning laws, and city planning documents. I knew that Maple Street was part of the Riverside District, a historically significant area that the city had been quietly discussing for future development. The proximity to downtown, the large lot sizes, the tree-lined streets, it all added up to potential that wasn't reflected in current property values. I also knew something about hard work that my comfortable suburban-raised family had never learned. In the Army, we had a saying, "Embrace the suck." It meant that when conditions were terrible, when the job seemed impossible, when everyone else was complaining, that's when you put your head down and got to work. That's when you proved what you were made of. My parents had been supportive when I enlisted, proud even. They liked telling their friends that their daughter was serving her country. But when I came back and announced I was buying a fixer-upper, instead of using my GI Bill to go to college immediately, their support turned into gentle concern. When they saw the house, gentle concern became open horror. "Sarah, honey," my mother said, standing in what used to be the front yard, careful not to let her shoes touch the bare dirt. "This isn't a house. This is a demolition project." My father, always more direct, shook his head and walked back to his car. "You're throwing your money away, mija. This neighborhood." He gestured vaguely at the houses around us, most of which were small but well kept. To him, they looked shabby compared to his suburban subdivision with its homeowners association and matching mailboxes. But I saw something they couldn't see. I saw a neighborhood with character, where people had roots that went back generations. I saw architectural details that cookie-cutter developments would never have. I saw space to breathe, to build, to grow something real. Standing on my front porch that first day, keys heavy in my hand, I felt a sense of ownership I had never experienced before. This was mine. Not the Army's, not my landlord's, not my parents'. Mine to fix, mine to improve, mine to call home. The house was a disaster, but it was my disaster. And I had 4 years of military training, 2 years of engineering experience, and a stubborn streak that ran deeper than the Rio Grande to help me turn it into something beautiful. My brother Miguel lived in a house that looked like it came straight out of a home and garden magazine. Everything about his life screamed success in the most obvious way possible, the kind of success that our parents understood and celebrated. His driveway was paved with interlocking stones that probably cost more than most people's cars, leading up to a 2-story colonial with perfectly manicured landscaping that someone else maintained twice a week. When I pulled my beat-up pickup truck into that immaculate driveway for Sunday dinner, the contrast couldn't have been more obvious. My truck, which I'd bought used from another veteran for $3,000, looked like it belonged at a construction site rather than in this suburban paradise. Paint cans rattled in the back, along with lumber scraps and a toolbox that had seen better days. My work boots were caked with mud from my latest project at the house, and my jeans had holes that weren't fashionable. They were functional, worn through from crawling around in tight spaces, fixing pipes and pulling electrical wire. Miguel opened his front door before I could even knock, his smile wide and welcoming, but tinged with something that looked suspiciously like pity. He was wearing khakis and a polo shirt that probably cost more than I spent on groceries in a month, his hair perfectly styled even though it was a casual family dinner. Everything about him radiated stability, success, and the kind of life that made parents proud at church gatherings. "Sarah, there's my little sister the homeowner," he said, pulling me into a hug that smelled like expensive cologne. "How's the renovation project going?" The way he said renovation project made it sound like a hobby. something I was doing to pass time rather than the complete gut and rebuild job it actually was. Miguel had never worked with his hands beyond changing a light bulb, and his idea of home improvement was calling a contractor to install crown molding that he'd seen on a home improvement show. His house was everything mine wasn't. The entryway had marble floors that gleamed under a crystal chandelier. Family photos lined the walls in matching frames, showing Miguel and his wife Carmen at various vacation destinations: Hawaii, Europe, the Caribbean. Their kids, my nephew, and niece were pictured in school uniforms from the private academy they attended, looking polished and perfect. "Carmen's in the kitchen putting the finishing touches on dinner," Miguel said, leading me through rooms that looked like furniture showrooms. "She's been experimenting with that new cookbook she got. You know how she is about trying new things." Carmen emerged from the kitchen wearing an apron over what was clearly an expensive dress, her makeup still perfect despite having spent the afternoon cooking. She greeted me with air kisses that didn't quite touch my cheeks, her smile warm but her eyes taking in my work clothes with barely concealed concern. "Sarah, sweetie, you look so outdoorsy," she said, which I was pretty sure wasn't meant as a compliment. "How's the house coming along?" "Miguel showed me the pictures you sent. It's quite an ambitious project." Their dining room could have hosted a state dinner. The table was set with china that I recognized from their wedding registry, crystal, glasses that caught the light from another chandelier, and cloth napkins that probably needed to be dry cleaned. Fresh flowers, actual fresh flowers, not the grocery store kind, served as a centerpiece that looked professionally arranged. Helped Carmen bring out serving dishes filled with food that looked like it belonged in a restaurant. She had clearly spent hours preparing everything, and part of me felt guilty for showing up in my work clothes when she had obviously gone to so much trouble. But another part of me bristled at the unspoken expectation that I should have changed, should have dressed up to eat dinner with my own family. The conversation during dinner inevitably turned to our respective living situations. Miguel talked about the new deck he was having built, a project that involved hiring a general contractor, a landscape architect, and someone whose job title was apparently outdoor living space designer. The cost he mentioned casually was more than I had spent on my entire house. "It's going to have built-in seating and a fire pit," he explained, cutting his perfectly prepared steak with silver that gleamed under the dining room lights. "Carmen found this amazing outdoor furniture set. That's weather-resistant but still elegant. We're thinking of having a barbecue once it's finished. You should come by." Carmen nodded enthusiastically. "The kids are so excited. They've been asking when Aunt Sarah is going to visit our new outdoor room. Speaking of which, how are things going with your place? Are you still doing all the work yourself?" There was something in her tone that suggested she found the idea of doing manual labor yourself to be quaint, like a hobby that I would eventually outgrow. Miguel and Carmen had never lived anywhere that wasn't move-in ready. Their first apartment after college had been in a luxury complex with a concierge and a fitness center. This house had been built 5 years ago by a developer who specialized in what he called executive homes for successful professionals. "The electrical work is almost finished," I said, trying to match their casual tone. "I've been learning, as I go, watching YouTube videos and getting advice from guys at the hardware store. It's actually pretty satisfying once you get the hang of it." Miguel raised his eyebrows. "YouTube videos? Sarah, you're dealing with electrical systems. Isn't that dangerous? What if you burn the house down?" "I'm being careful," I said, but I could see the look that passed between him and Carmen. It was the same look our parents exchanged when they talked about my phase of fixing up the house. Carmen leaned forward with what I was learning to recognize as her concerned face. "Honey, wouldn't it be easier to just hire professionals?" "I mean, when you add up all the time you're spending, plus the cost of materials, plus the risk of making mistakes that have to be fixed later, wouldn't it make more sense to get proper help?" Miguel nodded sagely. "That's what I keep telling her. Time is money, right? Sarah could get a real job, something that uses her military experience, and hire contractors to do the renovation work. She'd probably come out ahead financially, and she wouldn't have to live in a construction zone. The phrase real job hung in the air like smoke from a grease fire. I had been working 40 hours a week at a local logistics company while spending every evening and weekend on the house, but apparently that didn't count as real work in Miguel's worldview. Real work happened in offices with business casual dress codes and annual performance reviews. Their kids came downstairs after dinner, dressed in pajamas that looked more expensive than most of my work clothes. They were polite, well-behaved, children who spoke in complete sentences and said please and thank you without being reminded. Miguel and Carmen beamed with pride as the kids showed me their latest school projects and talked about their weekend activities: soccer practice, piano lessons, art classes at the community center. "Uncle Sarah," my niece said, "Daddy says you live in a broken house. Are you going to fix it or buy a new one?" The innocence of the question stung more than any adult criticism could have. Miguel quickly corrected her. "Aunt Sarah, sweetheart." But the damage was done. Even the children saw my house as something broken, something that needed to be replaced rather than restored. After dinner, Miguel walked me out to my truck, his expression serious in the way it got when he was about to give me big brother advice. "Sarah, I'm worried about you," he said, leaning against my tailgate. "This house thing, it's a lot of work for one person, and that neighborhood, it's not exactly up and coming, you know?" He gestured at his own street, where every house looked like a variation on the same theme, where the lawns were perfect and the driveways were spotless. "You could sell that place, take whatever you can get for it, and put that money towards something in a better area. Carmen and I could help you look at some condos closer to downtown. There are some really nice developments going up." The offer was generous, meant with love, but it felt like charity. Miguel couldn't understand that I didn't want a condo in a nice development. I wanted something that was mine, something I had built with my own hands, something that had character and history and stories in its walls. As I drove home through streets that got progressively less manicured, I thought about the difference between Miguel's life and mine. His was safe, predictable, comfortable. Mine was uncertain, challenging, sometimes frustrating. But it was also mine in a way that his beautiful, perfect house would never be his. The family barbecue was supposed to be a celebration of my cousin, Elena's promotion to partner at her law firm. She had worked at the same downtown practice for 8 years, climbing the ladder with the kind of methodical determination that our family understood and respected. The invitation had come with the usual family guilt. "You never come to anything anymore, Sarah. We barely see you since you bought that house." So I showed up, despite having spent the morning wrestling with a stubborn bathroom pipe that had decided to leak all over the floor I'd just finished installing. My hands still bore the evidence of the morning's work: small cuts from handling metal fittings, fingernails that no amount of scrubbing could completely clean, and the kind of bone-deep fatigue that came from crawling around in tight spaces for hours. Elena's backyard was the perfect setting for a family gathering, professionally landscaped with native plants that required minimal maintenance, a built-in barbecue island that probably cost more than some people's cars, and outdoor furniture arranged in conversation areas that looked like they'd been styled for a magazine photo shoot. Paper lanterns hung from mature oak trees, casting a warm glow over tables set with matching plates and coordinated linens. The guest list was the usual assembly of family success stories. My uncle Roberto, who owned 3 auto repair shops across the county. My Aunt Patricia, who taught at the university and never let anyone forget about her PhD in education. Various cousins who worked in real estate, accounting, and middle management positions at companies with impressive-sounding names. I grabbed a beer from the cooler and found myself gravitating toward the edge of the party, watching my relatives cluster around Elena as she recounted stories from her new corner office and the cases she was handling. Everyone hung on her words, asking questions about her work life, her income, her plans for the future. Sarah. My Aunt Patricia spotted me trying to blend into the background near the pool house. There you are. We were just talking about you. Elena was asking about your little house project. The phrase little house project immediately set my teeth on edge, but I forced a smile as Patricia steered me toward the group gathered around Elena. They made room for me in their circle with the kind of polite inclusion that felt more like curiosity than genuine interest. Elena, resplendent in a designer dress that probably cost more than I spent on groceries in 3 months, turned her attention to me with the kind of focused intensity she probably used on witnesses in court depositions. Sarah, I've been dying to hear about this house you bought. Miguel showed us some pictures, and I have to say, you're braver than I am. The way she said braver made it sound like I had volunteered for a dangerous medical experiment rather than bought a fixer-upper. Several people in the group chuckled, the kind of nervous laughter that people make when they're uncomfortable but trying to be supportive. It's coming along, I said, taking a long pull from my beer. Slow but steady progress. But why that neighborhood? Asked my cousin David, who worked in commercial real estate and considered himself an expert on property values. I mean, I get wanting to own something, but that area, it's not exactly an investment, you know? You'd have been better off buying something smaller in a better location. I felt the familiar tension building in my shoulders, the same feeling I used to get during military briefings, when civilian contractors would question our engineering decisions without understanding the constraints we were working under. The neighborhood has potential, I said carefully. Good bones, established community, room to grow. Elena laughed, the sound bright and sharp like breaking glass. Room to grow? Sarah, honey, that's real estate agent speak for nobody else wants to live there. I see properties like that come through the firm all the time in probate cases. Usually the families just want to dump them as quickly as possible. The group around us had grown larger, drawn by the conversation like spectators to an accident. I could see Miguel and Carmen approaching from across the yard, Miguel's expression already shifting into protective big brother mode. But before he could intervene, Elena was just getting warmed up. I mean, don't get me wrong, she continued, her voice carrying the authority of someone who was used to being the smartest person in the room. It's admirable that you want to do the work yourself. Very authentic. But at some point, you have to think practically. What's your exit strategy? Exit strategy? I repeated, feeling like I was speaking a foreign language. You know, your plan for getting out. Because let's be honest, you can't live in a construction zone forever. And that neighborhood isn't going to magically transform into somewhere desirable just because you put some sweat equity into one house. My uncle Roberto, who had been quietly nursing his beer and listening to the conversation, finally spoke up. Elena's got a point, mija. I've been in business for 25 years, and I've seen plenty of people throw good money after bad trying to fix up properties in declining areas. Sometimes you have to cut your losses. The word losses hit me like a physical blow. 8 months of 12-hour days, weekends spent learning plumbing and electrical work, evenings researching building codes and permit requirements, all of it dismissed as losses by people who had never held a wrench in their lives. It's not about cutting losses, I said, my voice staying steady despite the anger building in my chest. It's about building something. Elena's smile turned pitying, the expression she probably used with clients who insisted on representing themselves in court. Building something requires a solid foundation, Sarah, and I'm not talking about concrete and rebar. I'm talking about economic fundamentals, property values, neighborhood demographics, municipal development plans. You can't just will an area into becoming desirable. She gestured expansively, her engagement ring catching the light from the paper lanterns. Look, I'm not trying to be negative. I admire your determination, I really do. But determination doesn't change market realities. That house is going to be worth exactly what it was worth when you bought it. Maybe less once you factor in all the money you're putting into it. The conversation had drawn more family members into the circle, all of them listening with the kind of rapt attention usually reserved for traffic accidents. I could see pity in some faces, concern in others, and something that looked uncomfortably like secondhand embarrassment. "You could still get out," offered my cousin Maria, who worked as a mortgage broker and thought she understood real estate markets. "Cut your losses, sell it as is to some investor. Use whatever equity you can get as a down payment on something more practical." Elena nodded enthusiastically. "Exactly. There are some great condos going up downtown. Low maintenance, good resale, value, much better location for someone with your background. You could probably get into something really nice with your military benefits." The suggestion hung in the air like smoke from the barbecue, acrid and unwelcome. Around me, family members nodded agreement, their expressions suggesting they thought, Elena had just solved all my problems with typical lawyer efficiency, but what they saw as a practical solution felt like surrender. They wanted me to abandon the house that I had chosen, the project I had committed to, the vision I had spent months bringing to life one pipe fitting and electrical outlet at a time. They wanted me to admit that their way was better, that safety and predictability trumped ambition and vision. Elena, interpreting my silence as receptiveness to her advice, pressed on. "I could even help you find a good realtor, someone who specializes in properties like yours. You know, challenging situations that need creative marketing. We could probably get you out of this mess within 60 days. The word mess was the final straw. My house wasn't a mess. It was a work in progress. It wasn't a mistake. It was a choice. It wasn't something to escape from. It was something to build toward. But standing there surrounded by successful relatives in their designer clothes and their certainty about what constituted a good life, I realized that anything I said would only confirm their opinion that I was in over my head. They had already decided that my project was doomed, that my vision was unrealistic, that my investment was foolish. So I did what I had learned to do in the military when faced with civilian contractors who thought they knew better than the people actually doing the work. I smiled, nodded politely, and kept my mouth shut. Let them think what they wanted to think. Time would tell who was right. The drive home from Elena's barbecue felt longer than usual, every mile putting distance between me and their certainty about my failure. Their voices still echoed in my head. Exit strategy. Cut your losses. Challenging situations that need creative marketing. Words that stung more than I wanted to admit. But as I turned onto Maple Street and saw my house sitting there, in the growing dusk, something shifted inside me. It wasn't much to look at yet. I had to admit that. The new front steps I'd built were solid but unpainted. The windows were still covered with protective plastic sheeting, and the yard looked like a construction site, because that's exactly what it was. But it was mine. Every nail, every board, every pipe fitting had been chosen and installed by my own hands. I sat in my truck for a long moment, engine ticking as it cooled, and made a decision that would change everything. They thought I was naive. Fine. They thought I was throwing money away. Let them think that. They thought the neighborhood would never amount to anything? I would prove them wrong so completely that they'd choke on their condescending advice. The next morning, I woke up before dawn with the kind of clarity that comes from having your back against the wall. If I was going to succeed, and I was absolutely going to succeed, I needed to be smarter, work harder, and plan better than anyone expected. Elena's dismissive comments about municipal development plans had actually given me an idea. If she was so convinced that economic fundamentals mattered more than sweat equity, then I would master the economics too. I spent my lunch break that week at City Hall, buried in planning documents and zoning maps that most people never bothered to look at. The clerk, a tired-looking woman named Joyce, who had probably been there since the building opened, initially treated me with the polite indifference reserved for citizens requesting routine information. "You're looking at the Riverside District," she observed, watching me spread maps across the small table in the records room. "Planning to buy property there?" "Already did," I said, tracing the boundaries of the district with my finger. 847 Maple Street. Her expression shifted from indifference to something approaching sympathy. "Oh, honey, that old place? That's been empty for years. You sure you know what you're getting into?" But as I continued visiting City Hall over the following weeks, Joyce's sympathy turned to curiosity and then to something like respect. I wasn't just looking at pretty pictures. I was studying traffic patterns, utility infrastructure, demographic trends, and long-term development proposals that had been buried in committee reports for years. What I found made my heart race, with possibilities that Elena and her lawyer logic couldn't have imagined. The Riverside District wasn't declining, it was waiting. The city had been quietly laying groundwork for a major revitalization project, starting with infrastructure. Improvements that were already funded but not yet announced. New water mains, upgraded electrical grids, and a complete overhaul of the storm drainage system that would eliminate the flooding problems that had kept developers away. Even more interesting were the demographic studies showing that young professionals were increasingly priced out of downtown condos and looking for neighborhoods with character and space, the kind of space that Maple Street offered in abundance, with its large lots and mature trees and walking distance to the river trail that the Parks Department was planning to extend and improve. Armed with this knowledge, I threw myself into the renovation with renewed purpose. Every evening after my day job, every weekend, every spare moment was invested in transforming 847 Maple Street into something that would make Elena's law firm partners weep with envy. But I also did something that none of my successful relatives would have expected. I started building relationships with my neighbors. Mrs. Chen, who lived 2 houses down, had been watching my progress with polite curiosity since the day I moved in. She was a retired teacher who had lived on Maple Street for 37 years, and she knew every story the neighborhood had to tell. Over cups of coffee on her front porch, she told me about the families who had raised children here, the small businesses that had thrived before the suburban shopping centers drew customers away, and the community garden that had flourished, until budget cuts eliminated the city's support. "People think this neighborhood is finished," she said one Saturday afternoon, watching me carry lumber from my truck to the house. "But they don't know what we used to be. They don't see what we could be again." Mr. Rodriguez, who owned the corner store that had been in his family since the 1950s, became another ally in ways I hadn't expected. He started saving copper pipes and electrical fixtures that contractors threw away from other job sites, selling them to me at cost, because he said he admired what I was trying to do. Through him, I met other neighbors who were quietly investing in their properties, people who had been waiting for someone to believe in the neighborhood's potential. My evening routine became a rhythm of progress that felt more satisfying than anything I had experienced in the military or in my day job. Strip wallpaper until my arms ached, then reward myself with a cold beer on the front steps while watching the sunset paint the sky orange and pink. Sand floors until my back screamed, then take a hot shower in the bathroom I had plumbed myself, feeling the satisfaction of water flowing through pipes I had connected with my own hands. The work was harder than Elena or Miguel, or any of them could have imagined. There were nights when I fell into bed so exhausted that I couldn't even summon the energy to eat dinner. There were weekends when I spent more on materials than I made at my regular job, watching my savings account shrink with every trip to the hardware store. There were moments when I stood in rooms that looked worse after a day of work than they had when I started, wondering if I had bitten off more than I could chew. But there were also mornings when I woke up and realized that the house was starting to look like the vision I had carried in my head since the first day I walked through it. The kitchen, where I had torn out rotted cabinets, now had solid wood countertops I had built myself, and appliances I had researched for months to find the perfect balance of function and affordability. The living room, where water damage had warped the floors, now had refinished hardwood that gleamed like honey in the morning light. Most importantly, I was learning things that no amount of college education or corporate training could have taught me. I could wire a ceiling fan, tile a shower, replace a toilet, frame a wall, and diagnose mysterious sounds in plumbing systems. I could read building codes, calculate load-bearing requirements, and negotiate with suppliers who respected competence more than credentials. Every skill I mastered felt like armor against the doubt and dismissal I had faced at Elena's barbecue. They thought I was naive about economics. I was studying market trends and infrastructure development like a graduate student. They thought I was unrealistic about property values. I was creating value with every square foot of flooring I installed, and every outlet I wired. But the most important thing I was building wasn't visible in the house itself. I was building confidence in my own judgment, trust in my ability to see possibilities that others missed, and the kind of deep satisfaction that comes from creating something beautiful and functional with your own hands. Elena could keep her corner office and her designer clothes and her certainty about what constituted success. I was building something that would last longer than any legal brief and mean more than any quarterly profit report. The house on Maple Street was becoming more than a renovation project. It was becoming proof that sometimes the smartest investment isn't the safest one, and sometimes the biggest risk is not taking any risks at all. Growing up in the Martinez family meant understanding your place in an invisible hierarchy that had been established long before I was old enough to question it. Elena had always been the golden child, 2 years older than me and seemingly born with the kind of natural confidence that made adults lean in when she spoke. Even as children, when other kids were struggling with basic math, Elena was reading legal briefs that our lawyer grandfather left lying around, asking questions about courtroom procedure that made the grown-ups exchange impressed glances. He was the quiet one, the one who preferred building things with blocks rather than arguing about rules, the one who could spend hours taking apart old radios and television sets to see how they worked inside. While Elena practiced debate team arguments at the dinner table, I was in the garage with my father, learning how to change oil and replace brake pads on the family car. Our parents loved us both, but their pride manifested differently. Elena's achievements got framed certificates on the refrigerator, while my mechanical aptitude got approving nods and suggestions that I might make a good engineer someday. The disparity became more pronounced as we grew older. Elena's high school graduation was a celebration of academic awards, scholarship offers, and college acceptance letters from prestigious universities. Mine was marked by decent grades, a letter of acceptance to the state school, and the announcement that had shocked everyone. I was enlisting in the army instead of going directly to college. "But you're so smart, mija," my mother had said, holding my enlistment papers like they were contaminated. "Why would you want to go into the military when you could study engineering? You could have a good career, work in an office, have a stable life." Elena, home from her first year at university, had been more direct. "Sarah, this is crazy. You're throwing away your potential. Military service is fine for people who don't have other options, but you're smart enough to do something better." Even then, her dismissal stung. But I was 18 and stubborn and convinced that I knew what I wanted. The army would pay for my education eventually, and in the meantime, I would learn skills that no classroom could teach. I wanted to build things, to work with my hands, to see places beyond our small hometown where everyone already knew who you were and what you were supposed to become. During my 4 years of service, Elena finished law school, passed the bar, exam on her first try, and landed a position at a respected firm downtown. Our parents' Christmas letters were filled with updates about Elena's cases, her apartment in the trendy part of the city, her serious boyfriend who worked in finance. My own updates were shorter: stationed in Germany, then deployed to Afghanistan, building infrastructure and keeping equipment running in places that most people couldn't find on a map. When I came home on leave, family gatherings felt like performance reviews where I always came up short. Elena would regale everyone with stories from her legal cases, using terms that made her sound sophisticated and important. I would talk about construction projects and equipment maintenance, subjects that made people's eyes glaze over with polite boredom. "Sarah's doing important work too," my father would say, trying to balance the conversation. "She's serving her country." But I could see the unspoken comparison in everyone's expressions. Elena was building a career that would last decades, accumulating prestige and financial security with each passing year. I was spending my 20s in temporary assignments, living in barracks and shipping containers, sending most of my pay home to a savings account because there was nothing to spend it on in places where the nearest town was a day's drive away. The comparison followed me even after I completed my service and returned home permanently. Elena had been promoted to senior associate, was engaged to the finance boyfriend, and had bought a condo in a building with a doorman and a view of the city skyline. I was working at the logistics company, living in a furnished apartment, and trying to figure out what came next. "You should use your GI Bill," Elena advised during a family dinner, speaking with the authority of someone who had never doubted her own path. "Get your engineering degree, maybe an MBA. You're behind already. Most people your age have been in their careers for years, but it's not too late to catch up." The phrase "catch up" lingered in my mind for weeks afterward. Catch up to what? To whom? Elena's definition of success was the only one that seemed to matter in our family: professional advancement, financial stability, social status that could be easily explained to strangers at cocktail parties. When I announced that I was buying the house on Maple Street, the family reaction was swift and unanimous. Elena's concern was the most articulate, delivered with the kind of logical precision she used in legal arguments. "Sarah, I understand wanting to own property," she had said, over lunch at an expensive restaurant near her office. "Real estate can be a good investment if you do it right. But you're approaching this emotionally instead of strategically. That house, that neighborhood, they don't make financial sense." She had pulled out her phone and shown me comparative market analyses, crime statistics, and demographic data that painted Maple Street as a declining area with no prospects for improvement. Her argument was compelling, backed by facts and figures that seemed to prove her point beyond doubt. "You could take that same $30,000 and put it towards something in a better area," she continued. "Maybe not as much space, but location matters more than square footage. You'd build equity instead of throwing money into a sinkhole." But what Elena didn't understand, what none of them understood, was that I wasn't just buying real estate. I was buying the chance to build something that was entirely my own, to prove that their way wasn't the only way to succeed. I had spent 4 years following orders, living by someone else's schedule, working towards someone else's goals. The house represented freedom in a way that Elena's career ladder never could. Our childhood had been defined by expectations that felt as solid and unchangeable as the foundation of our family home. Elena would be the professional, the achiever, the one who brought prestige to the family name. I would be something else. Something more practical, perhaps, but ultimately less important. The dynamic had been reinforced by every family gathering, every conversation about our futures, every comparison that left me feeling like a rough draft of what Elena had perfected. She was the polished final version, articulate, ambitious, successful in ways that everyone could understand and admire. I was the earlier attempt, well-intentioned but ultimately lacking the refinement that really mattered. But standing in that house for the first time, seeing the potential hidden beneath layers of neglect and abandonment, I had recognized something that Elena's legal training had never taught her to see. Sometimes the most valuable opportunities are the ones that look like disasters to everyone else. Sometimes the smartest investment is the one that doesn't make sense on paper. My family's dismissal of the house purchase wasn't just about real estate markets or neighborhood demographics. It was about the fundamental difference between playing it safe and taking a chance, between following established paths and creating your own. Elena's success was impressive, but it was also predictable, the logical result of following all the right steps in the right order. What I was attempting was different. Riskier, certainly, but also potentially more rewarding in ways that had nothing to do with quarterly earnings or professional advancement. I was betting on my ability to see what others missed, to create value where others saw only problems, to build something beautiful from something broken. The house on Maple Street was my declaration of independence from a family hierarchy that had defined me as the lesser sister for too long. The alarm clock screamed at 5:30 a.m. every morning, but I was usually already awake, staring at the ceiling and mentally reviewing the day's tasks before my feet hit the cold floor. The routine had become sacred. Instant coffee that tasted like motor oil, a protein bar that claimed to be chocolate but fooled no one, and 30 minutes of driving through empty streets to reach the logistics company where I spent 8 hours, coordinating shipments and managing inventory databases. My cubicle at Meridian. Logistics was gray in the way that only corporate environments could achieve, not just the color of the fabric-covered walls, but the entire atmosphere seemed drained of vitality. I processed shipping manifests, tracked delivery schedules, and answered emails from clients who needed their products moved from point A to point B as efficiently as possible. The work paid decent money and used some of my military experience with supply chain management, but it felt like treading water while watching other people swim toward shore. The hardest part wasn't the mind-numbing repetition of the job itself, but the way it consumed the daylight hours when I most wanted to be working on the house. I would sit at my desk, fluorescent lights buzzing overhead, and think about the bathroom renovation that was waiting for me at home. The old cast-iron tub needed to be removed. The subfloor in that corner was soft and probably rotted, and I had been researching tile patterns for weeks to find something that would complement the original 1920s character of the house. Martinez, you got a minute? My supervisor, Dave, would appear at my cubicle entrance like a badly dressed genie, always needing something just complicated enough to eat into my lunch break. Dave was a decent guy who had worked his way up from the warehouse floor, but he had the soul-crushing ability to make even simple requests sound like emergency situations. The Henderson shipment is showing delayed in the system, but the client is calling every hour asking for updates. Can you track down what's happening with the carrier and get me something I can tell them? These interruptions happened multiple times every day, small fires that needed to be extinguished with phone calls and database searches and carefully worded emails that managed client expectations without admitting fault. By the time I resolved each crisis, another one would appear, and my lunch break, the 30 minutes I had planned to spend researching electrical codes or watching YouTube videos about plumbing techniques, would evaporate. The drive home was when I transitioned from Sarah the logistics coordinator to Sarah the general contractor. I would stop at hardware stores that stayed open late, wandering the aisles with lists scrawled on the back of work receipts, comparing prices on copper fittings and discussing tile adhesive options with employees who had become my informal advisors. Back. Again, Sarah? Jim, who worked evenings at Kowalski Hardware, had become accustomed to my daily visits. What's the project tonight? Trying to figure out why the shower in the upstairs bathroom has no water pressure, I would tell him, holding up pieces of old pipe that I had removed to diagnose the problem. These fittings are so corroded I can barely get them apart. Jim would examine the pipes with the expertise of someone who had seen every possible plumbing disaster, then lead me to the appropriate aisle where we would discuss the merits of different replacement options. These conversations became the highlight of my day, talking with someone who understood that sometimes the simplest problems required the most creative solutions. The evening work began as soon as I changed out of my business casual uniform and into clothes that could handle dust, paint, and the inevitable minor injuries that came with demolition work. The house had become my second job, except this one paid nothing and demanded everything I had to give. Some nights I focused on one specific task, removing the water-damaged drywall in the kitchen, sanding the hardwood floors in the living room, or trying to figure out why the electrical outlet in the dining room had never worked properly. Other nights were spent on research, studying building codes online and watching instructional videos that taught me techniques I would need for upcoming projects. The learning curve was steeper than I had anticipated. Military engineering had given me a solid foundation in problem-solving and project management, but residential renovation required a different set of skills. Every room in the house presented new challenges that YouTube videos and DIY books could only partially address. The bathroom renovation that I had optimistically planned to complete in 2 weekends stretched into 2 months. Removing the old tile revealed water damage that extended behind the bathtub and into the adjacent bedroom wall. Fixing the water damage required learning about moisture barriers and mold remediation. Installing the new tile required mastering techniques for cutting around pipes and creating perfectly level surfaces on walls that had been built before anyone cared about precision. Sleep became a luxury that I couldn't afford. Most nights I worked until 10 or 11, then spent another hour cleaning up and planning the next day's tasks. By the time I crawled into bed, my body ached in ways that reminded me of military training exercises, except those had been temporary hardships, with clear endpoints. This was a marathon with no finish line in sight. The isolation was the hardest part to bear. My coworkers at Meridian assumed I went home each night to relax in front of the television like normal people. My family thought I was going through some kind of phase that I would eventually outgrow. My few remaining friendships had withered, as I declined invitation after invitation, explaining that I was too busy with the house to meet for drinks or dinner. "Sarah, you're becoming a hermit," my friend Jessica complained during one of our increasingly rare phone conversations. "When's the last time you did something fun? Something that didn't involve power tools?" I couldn't remember. Fun had become the satisfaction of completing a difficult repair, the moment when water flowed properly through newly installed pipes, the way afternoon sunlight looked streaming through windows that I had cleaned and reglazed myself. These small victories sustained me through the grinding routine of work, renovation, sleep, repeat. The weekends were when I could make real progress, but they were also when the magnitude of the project became most overwhelming. Standing in rooms that looked worse after a day of demolition than they had before I started, I would sometimes wonder if Elena had been right about cutting my losses and buying something move-in ready. The doubts usually struck around 3 in the afternoon on Sundays, when my energy was depleted and my hands were too sore to grip tools properly. I would sit on the front steps, drinking water from a bottle that tasted like sawdust, and look at houses in the neighborhood where families were having barbecues or washing cars, or doing the kinds of normal weekend activities that I had forgotten existed. But then I would remember Elena's condescending smile, Miguel's pitying concern, and the chorus of family voices telling me that I was making a mistake. The memory of their certainty about my failure would revive my determination. I would go back inside, put on my safety glasses, and pick up whatever tool the next task required. The house was slowly transforming, but the process was transforming me as well. My hands, which had once been soft from office work, developed calluses and scars that told the story of every repair and renovation. My arms and shoulders grew stronger from carrying lumber and swinging hammers. My mind learned to think in 3 dimensions, to visualize how pipes and wires and structural supports fit together inside walls that I couldn't see. Most importantly, I was learning that I could endure more hardship and solve more complex problems than I had ever imagined. Each small success, a perfectly installed light fixture, a level floor, a wall that was finally straight and smooth, built confidence that carried over into the next challenge. The grinding daily routine was teaching me something that Elena's law school education and Miguel's corporate career had never required them to learn, that some kinds of success can't be achieved through intelligence or connections or following established procedures. Sometimes success requires the willingness to work harder and longer than anyone expects, to persist through problems that have no obvious solutions, and to believe in your vision even when everyone else thinks you're crazy. The water heater died. On a Tuesday night in February, during the coldest week the city had seen in 15 years. I discovered it when I turned on the bathroom faucet after work, and nothing but ice-cold water emerged, carrying with it the metallic smell of rust and failure. The basement revealed the full extent of the disaster. 20 gallons of water, spreading across the concrete floor, the ancient unit sitting in a puddle like a defeated soldier. I called 3 different plumbers that evening, but none could come out until the weekend. The earliest appointment I could get was Saturday morning, which meant 5 days of cold showers and heating water on the stove for basic hygiene. The estimate, when it finally came, was $1,800 for a new unit plus installation. Money I didn't have after spending my last paycheck on kitchen cabinets and the electrical work for the dining room. That night, sitting on my living room floor with a space heater running and a calculator in my hands, I faced the mathematical reality that had been lurking at the edges of my consciousness for months. I was running out of money faster than I was making progress on the house. The renovation costs were exceeding every budget I had created, and my day job barely covered living expenses, plus the mortgage payment. The credit card statements spread across the coffee table told the story in unforgiving numbers. Home Depot, Lowe's, Kowalski Hardware, and a dozen specialty suppliers. Each purchase seemed reasonable at the time, but together they represented a debt load that was growing faster than my ability to pay it down. The water heater emergency would push me past the point where I could pretend everything was under control. I called in sick the next day, something I had never done except when genuinely ill, and spent 8 hours researching water heater installation, procedures. YouTube videos, manufacturer websites, and online forums became my crash course in plumbing systems that I had never needed to understand before. By evening, I had convinced myself that I could install the unit myself if I could figure out how to afford it. The solution came from an unexpected source. Mrs. Chen mentioned during one of our porch conversations that her nephew owned an appliance store that specialized in scratch-and-dent items. "He gets water heaters that got dinged during shipping," she explained. "Nothing wrong with them except cosmetic damage, but he can't sell them as new. Might be worth a call." Tommy Chen's warehouse was located in an industrial district that looked like it had been forgotten by city planning decades ago. The building was utilitarian concrete and corrugated metal, surrounded by businesses that specialized in auto repair and metal fabrication. Inside, rows of appliances with minor imperfections waited for customers who cared more about function than appearance. 40-gallon electric, barely a scratch on it, Tommy said, running his hand over a unit that looked perfect to my untrained eye. Manufacturer rejected it because of a small dent on the side panel. "Your aunt says you're handy with tools. You think you can install it yourself?" The price was less than half what the plumbers had quoted for just the unit alone. I bought it that afternoon, along with the necessary fittings and flexible connectors that Tommy assured me I would need. Loading it into my pickup truck required help from 2 of his employees, and I spent the drive home alternating between excitement and terror about what I had committed to attempting. The installation manual was 30 pages of detailed diagrams and warnings written in the kind of technical language that assumed prior knowledge I didn't possess. Terms like temperature relief valve and dielectric unions might as well have been written in ancient Greek. I read the entire manual 3 times before touching a single tool, then watched a dozen YouTube videos that showed the process from different angles. The old water heater had to be disconnected from electrical lines, water supply, and gas connections before it could be moved. Each step revealed new complications: corroded fittings that refused to budge, electrical connections that didn't match current code requirements, and a discovery that the concrete pad where the unit sat had developed cracks that needed repair. Removing. The old unit required dismantling it piece by piece because it was too heavy to carry up the basement stairs intact. The tank had to be drained, the insulation stripped away, and the metal shell cut into manageable sections with a reciprocating saw. The work was dirty, exhausting, and filled with the kind of minor injuries that came from working in tight spaces with sharp metal edges. Installing the new unit was like solving a 3-dimensional puzzle where every piece had to fit perfectly, or the entire system would fail. The electrical connections required understanding voltage requirements and circuit breaker capacities. The plumbing connections demanded precision with pipe threading and joint compound application. Every step had to be completed in the correct sequence, and any mistake could result in flooding, electrical fires, or expensive damage that would cost more than hiring professionals. I worked on the installation for 3 days, starting each evening after work and continuing until exhaustion forced me to stop. My back ached from crawling around the basement floor, my hands were cut and bruised from wrestling with stubborn fittings, and my confidence wavered every time I encountered a problem that the manual didn't adequately address. The moment of truth came on Friday night when I turned on the electrical breaker and opened the water supply valves. The unit hummed to life with mechanical sounds that seemed either promising or ominous. I couldn't tell which. Water began filling the tank with a rushing sound that echoed through the basement, and I held my breath, waiting for leaks that would indicate catastrophic failure. Nothing leaked. The connections held, the electrical system functioned, and after an hour of heating time, hot water flowed from the upstairs faucets. The victory felt more significant than anything I had accomplished. In the military or at my day job, I had diagnosed a problem, researched the solution, acquired the necessary materials, and completed a complex installation that professional plumbers charged thousands of dollars to perform. But the success was overshadowed by a growing realization that this was only the beginning of a much larger crisis. The water heater emergency had consumed the last of my financial reserves, and major projects were still waiting. The kitchen renovation, the electrical panel upgrade, the roof repairs that I had been postponing until spring. Standing in my basement at midnight, looking at the new water heater that represented both triumph and impending disaster, I understood that I had reached the point where determination alone wouldn't be enough. I needed more money, more time, or more luck than any reasonable person could expect. The house was winning the war of attrition, demanding more resources faster than I could provide them. The euphoria of solving the water heater crisis lasted exactly until I checked my bank account balance the next morning. After paying for the new unit and taking unpaid time off work for the installation, I had less than $300 remaining until my next paycheck. The mortgage payment was due in 2 weeks, along with the electric bill and minimum payments on credit cards that were approaching their limits. For the first time since buying the house, I seriously considered Elena's advice about cutting losses and walking away. The math was simple and brutal. I was spending more money than I earned, working more hours than I could sustain, and falling further behind every month. The logical choice was to admit defeat before the situation became even worse. That weekend, I sat in my kitchen drinking coffee and staring at real estate listings for condos and apartments that I could afford on my current salary. Clean, modern spaces where other people handled maintenance and repairs, where I could come home from work and relax instead of facing another evening of demolition and construction. The fantasy of a simple life without constant crisis management was almost overwhelmingly attractive. The breakthrough came disguised as another catastrophe. I was replacing rotted floorboards in the upstairs hallway when my crowbar punched through what I thought was just another piece of damaged subflooring. Instead, it revealed a hidden compartment that had been sealed behind the baseboard for decades. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth that had somehow stayed waterproof through years of neglect, were original architectural drawings of the house dated 1923. The drawings were exquisite, hand-drafted with the kind of detail that modern blueprints never contained. They showed not just the house as it existed, but as it had been intended, with built-in bookcases, window seats, and decorative elements that had been removed or covered over through decades of modernization. More importantly, they revealed the house's original identity. It had been designed by Hermann Caldwell, an architect whose prairie school style had gained significant recognition in recent years. I spread the drawings across my kitchen table, my hands trembling slightly as I realized what I was looking at. This wasn't just a random old house that I had bought cheap. This was a historically significant property that had been forgotten by everyone except the city's Architectural Preservation Society. A quick internet search revealed that only 12 Caldwell houses remained in the city, and most were already protected by historic designation. The discovery changed everything about how I approached the renovation. Instead of simply updating the house to modern standards, I was now restoring an important piece of architectural history. The work became more complex, but also more purposeful. Every decision had to balance historical accuracy with practical functionality. I contacted the city's Historic Preservation Office the next morning, armed with the original drawings and photographs of the restoration work I had already completed. The preservation officer, a scholarly woman named Dr. Patricia Hoffman, agreed to visit the house that Saturday to assess its historical significance. Dr. Hoffman arrived wearing sensible shoes and carrying a leather portfolio that looked older than I was. She spent 3 hours examining the house, taking photographs and making notes in handwriting that was almost as precise as the original architectural drawings. Her excitement was barely contained as she discovered original details that I had unknowingly preserved during my renovation. "This crown molding is exceptional," she said, running her fingers along the carved woodwork in the living room. "And these built-in bookcases, they're exactly as Caldwell drew them. Most of his residential work has been heavily modified over the years, but this house retains remarkable integrity." What Dr. Hoffman told me next changed my understanding of both the house and my financial situation. Properties with historic designation were eligible for significant tax credits and grants for preservation work. More importantly, the city had recently established a revolving loan fund specifically for historic property restoration, offering low-interest financing to qualified applicants. "Based on what I see here," Dr. Hoffman said, "I believe this property would qualify for historic designation. The application process takes several months, but in the meantime, you might be eligible for emergency preservation grants to address structural issues." The grant application required documenting every aspect of the restoration work I had already completed, along with detailed plans for future phases. I spent the next 2 weeks photographing every room, cataloging original features, and writing descriptions of the techniques I had used to preserve historic elements while meeting modern building codes. The process was exhausting, but exhilarating. I was no longer just fixing up an old house. I was preserving an important piece of the city's architectural heritage. The work took on new meaning when I understood that future generations would be able to experience Caldwell's vision because of the choices I was making now. The first grant approval came 6 weeks later. $8,000 for structural repairs and foundation work. The check arrived on the same day that my credit card company had threatened to reduce my spending limit, and I actually cried with relief as I deposited it into my account. But the real transformation began when a Saichui local architecture firm reached out after hearing about the Caldwell discovery. Morrison and Associates specialized in historic preservation, and they were fascinated by the house's architectural significance and the quality of restoration work I had completed. "We've been following your project through Dr. Hoffman," explained Janet Morrison during our first meeting. "The craftsmanship you've demonstrated is exceptional, especially considering you're largely self-taught. We're wondering if you'd be interested in some consulting work." The consulting opportunity was perfect for my schedule and skills. Morrison and Associates needed someone who understood both historical preservation techniques and practical construction methods. I could work evenings and weekends, earning significantly more per hour than my logistics job paid, while gaining experience that would help with my own renovation. My first project was assessing the restoration needs of a 1920s commercial building, downtown, that the firm's clients wanted to convert into loft apartments. Walking through the space with Janet and her team, I found myself explaining construction techniques and identifying original features with confidence that surprised even me. "You have an excellent eye for this work," Janet commented as we examined exposed brick walls that previous renovations had tried to cover with drywall. "Have you considered making preservation consulting your full-time career? The idea had never occurred to me, but as we discussed the project details, I realized that I had accidentally stumbled into expertise that was both rare and valuable. My combination of military engineering background, hands-on renovation experience, and growing knowledge of historical building techniques made me uniquely qualified for work that most contractors couldn't handle. The consulting income began solving my financial crisis in ways I hadn't anticipated. Instead of struggling to afford materials for my own house, I was earning money that allowed me to buy quality supplies and even hire help for the most labor-intensive tasks. More importantly, each consulting project taught me techniques that I could apply to my own renovation. Working on the commercial building downtown, I learned advanced methods for brick repointing and mortar matching that I immediately used on my house's exterior walls. A church renovation project taught me about stained glass restoration techniques that helped me repair the original windows that I had carefully preserved. Each new project expanded my skills and my professional network. The transformation wasn't just financial, it was psychological. For the first time since buying the house, I felt like I was moving toward something positive rather than running away from disaster. The work was challenging and sometimes frustrating, but it was also deeply satisfying in ways that my logistics job had never been. My house became a laboratory where I could test techniques and materials before recommending them to clients. The kitchen renovation that I had been dreading became an opportunity to experiment with period-appropriate finishes and fixtures. The electrical work that had seemed impossibly expensive became a chance to learn about knob and tube systems that I would encounter in other historic properties. Word began spreading through the architecture and preservation community about the Caldwell house restoration and the quality of work I was producing. Dr. Hoffman recommended me for additional grant opportunities, and other preservation consultants started referring clients who needed someone with my particular combination of skills. The house that Elena had dismissed as a worthless investment was becoming the foundation of a career that I had never planned but was perfectly suited for. Every dollar I had invested in materials and tools, every hour I had spent learning new techniques, every mistake I had made and corrected, all of it was paying dividends in ways that traditional career planning could never have anticipated. Standing. In my living room on a Sunday evening, looking at crown molding that I had painstakingly restored to match Caldwell's original specifications, I realized that the house had transformed me as much as I had transformed it. I was no longer Sarah Martinez, the logistics coordinator who fixed up an old house as a hobby. I was becoming Sarah Martinez, the historic preservation specialist, whose expertise was increasingly sought after by clients who understood the value of authentic craftsmanship. The historic designation came through on a Thursday morning in late spring, accompanied by a formal letter from the city's preservation board that used phrases like architecturally significant and exceptional integrity to describe my house. Dr. Hoffman called within hours of the official notification, her voice bubbling, with excitement that matched my own. "Sarah, this opens up opportunities we didn't even discuss during the application process," she explained. "The city has been looking for exemplary restoration projects to feature in their heritage tourism initiatives. Your house could become part of the historic home tour circuit." The implications were staggering. Not only would the house qualify for additional preservation grants and tax incentives, but it would also gain recognition as one of the city's most important architectural treasures. The property that my family had dismissed as worthless junk was about to be officially designated as historically significant and worthy of protection for future generations. My consulting work with Morrison and Associates had evolved from occasional weekend projects to a steady stream of clients who specifically requested my involvement in their historic preservation efforts. The commercial building downtown had been such a success that 3 other property developers had hired the firm for similar projects, all of them asking for me to lead the historical assessment and restoration planning. "You've become our secret weapon," Janet Morrison told me during a project review meeting. Clients trust your recommendations because you understand these buildings from the inside out. You've actually lived through the restoration process, not just studied it in textbooks. The financial transformation was the most visible change, but it wasn't the most important one. My consulting income had grown to the point where I could afford to quit the logistics job and focus entirely on historic preservation work. For the first time since buying the house, I had enough money to complete renovations properly, rather than constantly compromising on materials and methods due to budget constraints. But more significantly, I had discovered that I possessed a rare combination of skills that made me uniquely valuable in a specialized field. My military engineering background gave me the analytical thinking necessary to diagnose structural problems and develop practical solutions. My hands-on renovation experience provided credibility with contractors and craftspeople who might otherwise dismiss academic expertise. My growing knowledge of architectural history allowed me to make informed decisions about preservation priorities and appropriate restoration techniques. The kitchen renovation that had seemed impossible 6 months earlier became a showcase project that balanced historical accuracy with modern functionality. Instead of installing generic cabinets from the home improvement store, I worked with a local millworker to recreate built-in storage based on Caldwell's original drawings. The appliances were carefully selected to complement the 1920s aesthetic, while meeting contemporary performance standards. Every detail of the restoration was documented with photographs and detailed notes that would serve as a reference for future preservation work. The process of researching period-appropriate materials and techniques had taught me skills that were directly applicable to my consulting projects. When clients asked about historically accurate paint colors or appropriate hardware choices, I could provide recommendations based on first-hand experience rather than theoretical knowledge. The house itself was becoming something extraordinary. Rooms that had been water-damaged disasters when I bought the property now showcased original architectural details that had been hidden for decades. The dining room's built-in china cabinet, revealed when I removed layers of paint and makeshift modifications, displayed the kind of craftsmanship that modern construction rarely attempted. The living room's restored hardwood floors gleamed with the patina that only came from nearly a century of careful maintenance and recent expert restoration. Neighbors who had watched my progress with polite skepticism began stopping by to ask questions about their own houses. Mrs. Chen brought over cookies and stayed for 2 hours discussing the possibility of nominating the entire block for historic district status. Mr. Rodriguez mentioned that several customers had asked about the restoration work they could see from the street, wondering if similar projects might be possible for their own properties. "You've started something here," Mrs. Chen observed, standing in my living room and admiring the restored crown molding. "People are beginning to see the neighborhood differently. They're starting to understand what we could be again." The ripple effects extended beyond immediate neighbors. Local real estate agents began bringing clients to look at properties on Maple Street, explaining that the area was experiencing a renaissance of historic preservation and architectural appreciation. Property values were beginning to reflect the renewed interest in the neighborhood's character and potential. My professional reputation was growing through word-of-mouth recommendations and the visibility of the house itself. Architects, contractors, and property developers who drove past the house would stop to examine the restoration work and ask for my business card. The quality of craftsmanship was evident even to casual observers, and many wanted to know who had completed such meticulous preservation work. The consulting business was expanding faster than I had anticipated. Morrison & Associates offered me a permanent position as their senior preservation specialist, with a salary that exceeded what most people in traditional careers earned after decades of advancement. Other architecture firms began competing for my services, recognizing that clients were specifically requesting my involvement in their projects. But the most profound transformation was internal. I no longer doubted my ability to solve complex problems or take on challenges that seemed beyond my experience level. The house had taught me that apparent disasters often contained hidden opportunities, that patient work could overcome seemingly impossible obstacles, and that expertise could be developed through determination and careful study. The woman who had sat in Elena's backyard listening to condescending advice about cutting losses and buying a sensible condo was gone. In her place was someone who understood that the most valuable investments often looked like the worst decisions to people who lacked vision or courage. I had learned to trust my instincts, to see potential where others saw only problems, and to persist through difficulties that would have defeated someone with less commitment. My relationship with the house had evolved from ownership to stewardship. I was no longer just fixing up a property for my own use. I was preserving an important piece of architectural history for future generations. The responsibility was both humbling and inspiring, requiring standards of workmanship and historical accuracy that went far beyond typical home improvement projects. The transformation was visible to anyone who had known me before the house purchase. My confidence in professional settings, my ability to discuss complex technical subjects with authority, my reputation for delivering exceptional results, all of these changes could be traced back to lessons learned while crawling through basements and studying architectural drawings by lamplight. Standing in my restored kitchen on a Saturday evening, surrounded by the warm glow of period-appropriate lighting fixtures and the satisfaction of work well done, I realized that the house had given me something more valuable than financial success or professional recognition. It had taught me that I was capable of far more than anyone, including myself, had ever imagined. The quiet satisfaction of that realization was worth more than any external validation could ever be. The phone call from the city planning office came on a Tuesday afternoon while I was installing period-appropriate light fixtures in what would soon be featured as the master bedroom in next month's historic home tour. The voice on the other end was crisp, professional, and completely unaware that she was about to deliver news that would vindicate every risk I had taken over the past 2 years. Ms. Martinez, this is Jennifer Walsh from the Municipal Development Office. I'm calling to inform you about a significant infrastructure project that will affect your neighborhood. The City Council has approved the Riverside District Urban Renewal Initiative, and your property at 847 Maple Street falls within the designated redevelopment zone. My hand tightened on the phone as she continued explaining details that I could barely process. $3 million in federal and state funding had been allocated for comprehensive neighborhood improvements. New sidewalks, underground utility lines, an expanded public transportation hub, and most significantly, the creation of a designated historic district that would protect and promote the area's architectural heritage. We'll be sending detailed information packets to all affected property owners, Jennifer continued. But I wanted to give you advance notice since your property has been specifically identified as an anchor point for the historic preservation component of the project. After hanging up, I sat in my partially restored bedroom and tried to comprehend what had just happened. Every skeptical comment from my family, every concerned suggestion about cutting my losses, every condescending remark about my little project suddenly seemed monumentally short-sighted. The neighborhood that Elena had dismissed as having no prospects for improvement was about to become the centerpiece of the city's most ambitious revitalization effort in decades. The information packet arrived 3 days later, containing maps, timelines, and detailed descriptions of improvements that would transform Maple Street into a showcase of historic preservation and sustainable urban development. The city had identified 12 architecturally significant properties in the district, with my house featured prominently as an example of exceptional restoration work that other property owners should aspire to match. But the most stunning revelation was buried in the appendix of economic impact studies. Property values in similar historic districts typically increased by 150 to 200% within 5 years of designation and infrastructure improvements. Conservative estimates suggested that houses like mine, which had already been restored to historical standards, could easily be worth 10 times their current market value once the redevelopment project was completed. I called Dr. Hoffman immediately, my voice shaking with excitement and disbelief. Patricia, did you know about this? Did you know the city was planning such a massive investment in the Riverside District? Her laughter was warm and knowing. Sarah, why do you think I was so enthusiastic about your historic designation application? The Preservation Board has been working with the planning department for 3 years to identify properties that could anchor a major revitalization effort. Your house was always at the top of our list. The implications were staggering. My $30,000 investment, which family members had called foolish and financially irresponsible, was about to become worth more than all of their suburban homes combined. The sweat equity I had invested through 2 years of evening and weekend renovation work had created value that no traditional investment strategy could have matched. More importantly, my consulting business was perfectly positioned to benefit from the increased demand for historic preservation expertise that the redevelopment project would generate. Property owners throughout the district would need guidance on restoration techniques, historical accuracy, and compliance with preservation standards. I had accidentally created exactly the right expertise at exactly the right time. The news spread through the neighborhood with the speed of wildfire. Mrs. Chen appeared at my door within hours of the official announcement, her face glowing with vindication and excitement. 37 years I've lived on this street, she said, settling into the chair on my front porch that had become her unofficial spot for our evening conversations. 37 years I've been telling people that this neighborhood had good bones, that it just needed someone to believe in it again. You believed, Sarah. You saw what the rest of us hoped for but couldn't quite picture. Mr. Rodriguez was equally effusive when I stopped by his store the next morning. I knew you were different from the day you bought that house, he said, gesturing toward the construction materials and tools that had become a permanent fixture in his inventory since I'd started shopping there. Most people drive through this neighborhood and see problems. You drove through and saw possibilities. The media attention began almost immediately. The local newspaper wanted to feature my house as a success story of individual initiative and urban renewal. Architecture magazines requested interviews about the restoration techniques I had developed. Real estate publications wanted to discuss the investment potential of historic preservation in emerging neighborhoods. But the most satisfying moment came when Janet Morrison called to discuss expanding our professional relationship. Sarah, with this redevelopment project moving forward, we're going to need someone to coordinate historic preservation efforts across the entire district. We'd like to offer you a partnership in the firm, with primary responsibility for all residential preservation projects. Partnership. The word carried implications that went far beyond salary increases or professional recognition. Morrison & Associates was one of the most respected architecture firms in the region, and they were offering me an ownership stake based on expertise I had developed by accident while trying to save money on my own renovation. The transformation was so complete that I sometimes felt like I was living someone else's life. 2 years earlier, I had been a logistics coordinator living in a furnished apartment, spending my evenings watching television and wondering what I wanted to do with my life. Now, I was a historic preservation specialist with a partnership offer from a prestigious firm, living in an architecturally significant house that had become a model for urban renewal initiatives. The house that Elena had called a challenging situation that needed creative marketing was about to be featured in national publications as an example of successful historic preservation. The neighborhood that my family had dismissed as declining was being hailed as a visionary example of sustainable urban development. The investment that they had all urged me to abandon was about to generate returns that none of their traditional financial strategies could match. Standing in my restored living room, surrounded by architectural details that I had painstakingly preserved and enhanced, I felt a deep sense of vindication that had nothing to do with proving anyone wrong. I had trusted my instincts when everyone else counseled caution. I had worked harder than anyone thought necessary to achieve results that exceeded everyone's expectations. I had turned disaster into triumph through persistence, vision, and the willingness to take risks that more cautious people would never consider. The house had taught me that the most valuable opportunities often disguise themselves as impossible, challenges that expertise could be developed through determination and careful study, and that the biggest risks sometimes offered the greatest rewards. These were lessons that no amount of formal education or professional training could have provided. But most importantly, I had learned to trust myself completely. My judgment, my instincts, my ability to see potential where others saw only problems, all of these qualities had been tested and proven through the crucible of restoration work that had demanded everything I had to give. The woman who had sat quietly at family gatherings while relatives offered unsolicited advice about real estate markets and investment strategies was gone forever. In her place was someone who understood that the most profound transformations often happen when you stop listening to other people's limitations and start believing in your own possibilities. The invitation to Elena's firm's annual partner celebration arrived on elegant cardstock that probably cost more than most people spent on their entire wedding invitations. The event was being held at the Riverside Country Club, one of those establishments that prided itself on exclusivity and traditions that dated back to when such places openly discriminated against anyone who didn't fit their narrow definition of acceptable society. I almost didn't go. The timing was inconvenient. I had 3 consulting projects in various stages of completion, and the historic home tour was only 2 weeks away. But something about the invitation's formal language and presumptuous tone made me reconsider. The pleasure of your company is requested sounded more like a command than an invitation, and I found myself curious about how Elena's world would react to the news about the Riverside District redevelopment. The country club's parking lot told the story of professional success in automotive terms. BMWs, Mercedes, and Lexus sedans arranged in neat rows like expensive soldiers at attention. My pickup truck, clean but obviously used for actual work, looked like it had wandered into the wrong neighborhood. The valet who took my keys tried to hide his confusion about where to park a vehicle that clearly didn't belong in this setting. Inside, the club's decor was everything I expected. Dark wood paneling, oil paintings of long-dead members, and furniture that looked like it had been selected to intimidate rather than comfort. Groups of well-dressed professionals clustered around cocktail tables, their conversations a blend of legal jargon, investment strategies, and carefully modulated complaints about taxes and regulations. Elena spotted me before I had even collected a drink from the bar. She approached with the kind of smile that lawyers perfected for difficult clients, bright and welcoming, but somehow calculating at the same time. "Sarah, I'm so surprised you came," she said, air-kissing my cheeks while her eyes performed a quick inventory of my outfit. I had chosen carefully. A simple black dress that was appropriate for the occasion, but not trying too hard to impress. "How are things going with your little house project?" The phrase, "little house project," immediately transported me back to every family gathering where my renovation work had been dismissed as a hobby rather than a serious endeavor. But now, armed with knowledge about the redevelopment project and my growing professional reputation, the condescension felt almost quaint. "Actually, things have been going very well," I replied, accepting the wine glass that Elena pressed into my hand. "I've been keeping pretty busy with consulting work." Elena's expression shifted slightly, the kind of micro-expression that suggested she was recalibrating her approach based on new information. "Consulting? What kind of consulting?" Before I could answer, we were joined by Elena's colleague Marcus, a senior partner whose handshake was designed to communicate dominance through grip strength. Elena introduced me as her cousin, the one who had bought the old house, and Marcus's polite interest immediately transformed into barely concealed pity. "Real estate can be tricky," he said with the authority of someone who had never actually bought a fixer-upper. "Location is everything, of course, but sometimes you can find good value in emerging neighborhoods if you're willing to take risks." The irony of his comment was so perfect that I had to resist the urge to laugh. Marcus clearly had no idea that he was standing 3 miles away from what would soon be recognized as one of the city's most successful neighborhood transformations, offering unsolicited advice to someone whose property investment was about to generate returns that would make his stock portfolio look conservative. Risk can be relative, I said carefully. Sometimes what looks risky to outside observers actually makes perfect sense when you understand the fundamentals. Elena nodded sagely, apparently deciding that my comment was sufficiently vague to warrant her professional agreement. That's very true. Sarah has always been practical about these things. Military training, you know, they teach you to assess situations realistically. Her explanation was clearly intended to provide context for my unconventional choices, while subtly suggesting that my decision-making process was influenced by experiences that her colleagues couldn't relate to. It was a masterful piece of social positioning that allowed her to support me while simultaneously distancing herself from my choices. The conversation continued in this vein for several minutes, with Elena and Marcus offering gentle advice about property management and investment, strategies that they had obviously never tested in real-world situations. Their suggestions were theoretical, based on market analysis and professional opinions, rather than actual experience with renovation work or neighborhood development. You know, Marcus said, warming to his subject, if you ever decide to sell, I know some investors who specialize in properties that need significant work. They might be able to offer you a fair price, save you the trouble of completing all those renovations yourself. The suggestion was so perfectly timed that it felt like a setup for the revelation I was about to deliver. Actually, I'm not planning to sell anytime soon. The city just announced a major redevelopment project for the Riverside District. $3 million in infrastructure improvements, historic district designation, the whole package. The effect of my words was immediate and dramatic. Elena's wine glass paused halfway to her lips, her expression shifting from polite interest to sharp attention. Marcus's condescending smile faltered as he processed the implications of what I had just said. $3 million? Elena repeated, her lawyer instincts immediately focusing on the financial significance. For your neighborhood? The Riverside District Urban Renewal Initiative, I confirmed, enjoying the way their assumptions were crumbling in real time. Federal and state funding for comprehensive improvements. My house has been designated as an anchor property for the historic preservation component. Marcus recovered first, his professional demeanor reasserting itself as he calculated the implications. That's significant. Property values in designated historic districts typically see substantial appreciation. You could be looking at a considerable return on your investment. The understatement was so profound that I had to bite my tongue to keep from laughing. Conservative estimates suggested that my $30,000 investment would be worth at least $300,000 within 5 years, with the potential for even greater appreciation as the redevelopment project attracted more residents and businesses to the area. Elena's reaction was more complex. I could see her legal mind working through the implications, recognizing that my supposedly foolish investment decision was about to generate returns that none of her carefully planned financial strategies could match. The house that she had encouraged me to abandon was about to become worth more than her downtown condo. How did you know? She asked, her voice carrying a note of genuine curiosity mixed with something that might have been admiration. How did you know that the city was planning such a significant investment? The question revealed the fundamental difference between our approaches to decision-making. Elena made choices based on existing data, market trends, and professional advice from experts who specialized in risk assessment. I had made my choice based on instinct, vision, and the willingness to see potential in situations that others dismissed as problems. I didn't know, I admitted. I just believed in the neighborhood's potential. Sometimes you have to trust your instincts even when the conventional wisdom suggests you're making a mistake. The honesty of my answer seemed to catch both Elena and Marcus off guard. They were accustomed to success stories that followed predictable patterns, careful planning, expert advice, calculated risks that minimized downside exposure. My approach had been fundamentally different, based on intuition and commitment rather than analysis and hedging. Standing there in the country club's opulent surroundings, surrounded by the trappings of conventional professional success, I realized that I had achieved something that none of Elena's colleagues could claim. I had transformed disaster into triumph through vision, persistence, and the courage to ignore everyone who told me I was making a mistake. The validation was complete, but it felt different than I had expected. Instead of triumph, I felt a quiet satisfaction that had nothing to do with proving anyone wrong and everything to do with proving myself right. The conversation at the country club continued for another hour, with Elena introducing me to colleagues as my cousin, the historic preservation expert. The transformation was complete. I had gone from the family disappointment with the junk house to someone whose expertise was worth showcasing to senior partners at prestigious law firms. 3 months later, the first phase of the Riverside District redevelopment began. Construction crews started installing new sidewalks and underground utilities while property values climbed steadily upward. My consulting business had grown so rapidly that I hired 2 assistants and opened an office in the renovated building downtown that had been my first major project. The house on Maple Street became everything I had envisioned and more. Featured in architectural magazines, included on historic home tours, and valued at over $400,000, it stood as proof that sometimes the best investments are the ones that everyone else thinks are crazy. Elena never directly acknowledged that she had been wrong about my decision, but she didn't need to. At last year's family Christmas gathering, she spent most of dinner asking detailed questions about my work and mentioning to other relatives that I had always been the visionary in the family. Miguel still talks about his deck project occasionally, but now he also asks for advice about potentially historic features in his own house. The dynamic has shifted completely. I'm no longer the sister who made questionable choices, but the one who had the courage to see opportunities where others saw only problems. The greatest satisfaction isn't the financial success or professional recognition, though both are gratifying. It's the knowledge that I trusted myself when no one else would, persisted when everyone advised me to quit, and built something beautiful from something broken. Sometimes the loudest revenge really is silence, followed by success that speaks for itself. If you enjoyed this story of transformation and triumph, make sure to subscribe for more inspiring tales of people who refuse to give up on their dreams. Hit that subscribe button and the notification bell. You won't want to miss what's coming next.